I loved the original Netflix series, which resides comfortably within my top 10 television shows of all time. In fact, I dropped a series review on this channel a year or so ago. I was, of course, initially a bit distraught at the news of Daredevil's cancellation back in 2018, especially considering it ended with a tease for the future. After a year or two, my grief had basically subsided. I was actually wishing that the bullseye stinger from the final episode was non-existent, because then the piece would act as a satisfying series conclusion. Then, eventually, this born-again revival was announced, and I didn't have much of a reaction of any kind. I believed I had already and irreversibly closed the book on this particular brilliant incarnation of Matt Murdock. I had essentially moved on. But given the fact that I'm basically elbow deep in this TV and film field, I couldn't help but sort of subconsciously follow the reported production complications, rewrites, reworkings, and honestly, all of that hullabaloo left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. I had this mindset that I surely would no longer be able to experience and enjoy this series without any preconceived notions. I wasn't even entirely set on viewing this series at all, but finally, I decided to check out the Born Again premiere, and I am exceedingly fucking glad that I did. I believe there were two primary components this revival needed to successfully recreate to a certain extent in order for me to consider it a worthy successor to the Netflix iteration. The dynamic between Matt Murdock and Wilson Fisk, and the largely grounded but always gritty tone. And thus far, they've done so in spades. The brilliant pair of Charlie Cox's Murdock/Daredevil and Vincent D'Onofrio's Fisk/Kingpin slip back into their kind of legendary roles with ease. This dynamic continues to be electric. They're just as compelling to view act across from one another now than they were nearly 7 years ago. Speaking of returning players, it's great to see Eldon Henson's Foggy Nelson and the talented Deborah Ann Wool's Karen Page, two essential cogs in the NM&P law-centric trio. These three feel like family at this point, at least at the commencement of the first episode. And the original plan, at least according to what seemed to be quite reputable sources, was for Karen to simply go unmentioned entirely, and for Foggy to have been killed off screen prior to the series beginning by a corrupt cop. But their collective appearance, although quite brief, provided a great amount of emotional engagement for me personally, and if I'm not mistaken, Bullseye was originally not going to appear. So this whole opening, which includes the great Wilson Bethel, ties up loose ends from episode 313 prior to a bit of a time jump. All the while, we're given a collection of intriguing new characters throughout these first few hours of the show. I'm primarily referring to the late Comar de los Reyes' Hector Ayala, aka White Tiger, Clark Johnson's Cherry, Michael Gandolfini's Daniel Blake, Janaea Walton's B.B. Urich, Nikki M. James Kristen, James, and Margarita Leviva's Heather. Hector is probably the strongest addition following my viewing of episodes 1 through 4. Not only is he engaging in his own right, backed by a strong performance, he also serves the story and its titular character beautifully. Prior to the 1-year time jump, White Tiger is established as an active vigilante, as is Daredevil at this time. Then the Devil of Hell's Kitchen goes away, so White Tiger becomes the town's lone street-level hero. That is before Matt ultimately becomes Hector's lawyer, which is such a bloody smart creative decision. This particular plot point forces Matt to confront his personal internal conflict with the mere concept of vigilantism. The late actor genuinely does a brilliant job in this relatively brief but essential role. I'll return to the White Tiger in a bit. It didn't take long before I was drawn to the character of Cherry. The actor is strong and natural. I really dig his dynamic with Matthew from the moment he learns his true identity prior to the opening credits rolling. He's calm, cool, clever, and as Matt's private investigator, he seems to be one of the very few remaining trustworthy individuals in his life. He's a good man, and honestly, given his bold and righteous nature, I'm a bit scared for his safety going forward, a la Ben Urich, which I'll get back to. I got a kick out of this Daniel Blake character, and that entertainment commenced prior to my learning that this actor is the son of the late great James Gandolfini. This kid's got this interesting charisma, and I love his sort of enthusiastic fan foil to the spectacularly over-serious Mayor Fisk. I'm really looking forward to this particularly peculiar relationship being further explored, especially now that Wilson has basically threatened his life in the case that he puts another toe out of line. We've certainly been introduced to the brave and bold personality and ambition possessed by Bibi Urich, much like her late Uncle Ben, but thus far she's mostly been the poster woman for the strong and unique framework of Born Again, the sporadically displayed Bibi report, which gives us an inside look at the perspectives and opinions held by a number of unique citizens within Hell's Kitchen. I like this Kirsten character, essentially Foggy's replacement at the firm. I'm not necessarily as enticed with this creation to the extent that I am with some others, but I've genuinely enjoyed her presence, her energy thus far. She's wonderfully naturalistic, while her cute, banter-filled dynamic with Matt provides some grin-inducing levity, and I'm intrigued to discover what becomes of this Heather character. She's this intelligent therapist who not only develops a sweet relationship with Mr. Murdoch, of the romantic variety, she's ultimately the counselor of Mayor Fisk alongside wife Vanessa, not the safest of company. The first episode, entitled Heaven's Half Hour, kept me engaged from the first to the final frame. The show feels not too different, but different enough that the story feels revitalized and relatively fresh. The cinematography and direction, speaking specifically of this premiere episode, is a slight departure from the OG series in certain respects, though it remains consistently captivating. We get a plentiful amount of sometimes extensive zoom-ins and outs, which is new and interesting, while we're gifted on a couple occasions bloody fantastic oneers, for which the Netflix show was quite famous. And like that 3-season series, this show, at least its beginnings, has been dark and thoughtful, both of them containing a collection of awesome performances. If the 4th season had dropped on Netflix shortly after the 3rd, I wouldn't have felt it to be necessary that the series drop a drastic narrative bomb in order to propel the plot into motion, but we're talking about a continuation following a well over half-decade absence, and so we are appropriately, in my opinion, dropped directly into Daredevil at its most impactful. It's extremely emotionally effective, whilst the combat is both enthralling and visceral. Foggy's murder is heart-wrenching, and the scene in which it takes place is phenomenally edited and just executed in general. Daredevil and Bullseye crash through the window of Josie's bar shortly after Mr. Nelson is shot, at which point an excellent oneer commences, a major visual highlight of which being the lighting-centric alterations. There's this intensely smoky atmosphere before the lights are abruptly knocked out, which forces the action to appear as though it is occurring within a fucking graveyard. All of this taking place prior to a bit of a strobe light sequence. After the combat has moved through the bar and slowly, violently made its way up the staircase, we sporadically cut back via Matt's enhanced hearing, which is very stylistically depicted, to a sobbing Karen encouraging a bleeding Foggy to hold on. This particular editing choice adds this great layer of urgency to all of the enthralling fighting. Once we reach the rooftop, we're given the scene's most heart-pumping moments. It's exceptionally gratifying viewing Matt beat the fucking piss out of Dex. The always amazing Deborah Ann Wool's Karen wails as Foggy breathes his last breath. Charlie Cox hurt my soul as he broke down with Bullseye in his grasp, and with literally 0 lines of dialogue, Wilson Bethel truly cements our hatred toward this Poindexter prick, with a toothy grin right in Matt's devastated face, as well as a particularly nefarious arm pat. Then Matt lets his fury take control as he fucking pushes Bullseye off the top of the building in an attempt to kill him. I adore the fact that, given the gravity of this choice made by Mr. Murdoch, we're not given a heavy-handed, slow-motion drop from Bullseye, accompanied by a big, extensive reaction from Matt. What is done is far more brutal and impactful. In fact, my jaw was on the floor. Daredevil grabs this bastard's melon, then tosses him off the rooftop like he were a literal piece of trash. It's so bloody satisfying, and although Dex ultimately survives this fall, this action is an awesome catalyst for Born Again's story. Matt has got the same one rule as Batman: don't kill. He abides by this rule for the entirety of the Netflix show, although he's tempted on more than one occasion. Matt meant for a man to be killed by his hand, so he drops the Double D persona, as he believes he no longer deserves to don the mask. We're then given a gorgeous, smooth transition. Matt's mask slowly falls to the streets beneath before, without cutting away, the red mask morphs into the grayish stone one that starts off this opening theme. Speaking of the revamped opening title sequence, I dig it. Rather than draw a comparison to the OG opening, I shall instead state that this is an awesome follow-up / reinterpretation. The two introductions largely feel tonally similar, while the new visuals are more complex, though perfectly fitting, as a demolition is depicted of various important prevalent structures prior to the rebuilding of a stone Daredevil structure. I enjoy the music within the opening, as well as the pretty thrilling original pieces we hear outside of it, whilst on multiple occasions we hear some actual lyric-filled tunes, which have been perfectly placed, tonally fitting, and cool and stylized. Nearing the first episode's conclusion, we're given a sensational tete-a-tete between electric adversaries Matt and Wilson in a diner. This piece forces you to ask yourself the biggest question thus far, really. What will it take to force lawyer Matthew Murdock to return to his life of vigilantism? And on the opposite side of the coin, what will it take to truly push newly elected Mayor Wilson Fisk, who claims to be attempting to turn over a new leaf, back to his brutal, unequivocally villainous ways? Episode 2, entitled Optics, wasn't quite as awesome as the first, but it was still very well done, with two wicked highlights in particular. One starring Fisk, the other starring Murdock, both of them pertaining to the concept I just mentioned. What is going to be the line we inevitably reach that will force these complex men to completely embrace their alter egos? And I do think there's this element of outside parties, sometimes even unknowingly, assisting in furthering along this inevitability, simply by telling Kingpin, for example, who he was and who he remains to be, and that he does not possess the ability to change. I'm referring here to the scene taking place following a cop's funeral. It is just outside the cemetery that Wilson is confronted and verbally eviscerated by the no bullshit police commissioner. Before Fisk is able to croak out a single sentiment about his civic pride, this mustached man calls him a convict bitch baby who will never be anything other than a thug. Wilson seethes before creepily blackmailing the man into being in his palm. Then at episode's end, we view an extraordinarily tense situation unravel, which physically forces Matt to erupt and break some fucking arms. Of course, we've been told from the horse's mouth that this lawyer wants the city's problems to be handled in the courtroom. But this is a major moment that essentially makes it clear that that isn't really an option anymore. The combat that closes out Optics is a brutal blast to watch. The reveal of the inked Punisher insignia is also an eyebrow raiser in an intrigued way, not a confused one. While the first episode was quite great and the second episode was quite good, the quality of number 3 was closer to number 1's caliber, though these two pieces are quite different from one another. One is bigger and louder while it spans over a year. The other is slower, more so quietly intelligent, nearly its entire duration taking place in the courtroom. All of the lawyer speak is super smartly written and unsurprisingly wonderfully acted. There's such an immense amount of tension as Hector's verdict is about to be announced, and the triumph I felt following this good man's acquittal being quickly kiboshed in such an abrupt and cruel way was a bold and effective creative decision, and it's perfectly in line with the series' narrative. This is the most overt sign to Matt thus far that the system is not going to solve this hellhole's problems. Camar de los Reyes' Hector Ayala, the episode's credits paying tribute to the late actor, is really the heart of this piece. I love his quiet but intense and sincere demeanor. Nearing the episode's beginnings, Hector delivers a monologue to Matt about the calming sounds of nature, primarily the call of a particular tree frog within his hometown, before Matt assures him that he will one day return. The credits roll directly following the moment in which a corrupt copper, once again donning a Punisher logo, pops White Tiger. And instead of us hearing a badass score, we hear the calming sounds of the tree frogs back in his home country. This was a beautiful, creative choice. While I was jotting down notes for this video, the 4th episode dropped. I was initially planning on discussing the events of Sic Semper Systema in a probable eventual video in which I conduct a review for the entire first season, but my anticipation to think about, then blab about episode 104 has simply overtaken me, so fuck it. Essentially, my sole gripe here is a nitpick, as I really enjoyed this whole episode. There may be a spinning plate or two too many. I think I was initially slightly overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of characters and plot points being followed, but not a single one of these spinning plates crash. I was engaged with each and every scene, and I quickly started to learn that each of these pieces connect to and kind of bleed into one another. We're given this weird and interesting interaction at a club between Mr. Blake and Miss Urich. This directly connects to Mr. Fisk and his multifaceted empire, while proud employee Daniel tries to flaunt his big important position to the very pretty BB. The young journalist evidently just wants to pour drinks down the guy's throat so that he spills the beans on Wilson's behind-the-scenes dealings. Fisk seethingly deals with the repercussions whilst attempting to balance his business with his troubled marriage, the counseling being facilitated by Matt's therapist, lady friend Heather. Early on in the episode, Fisk and company are doing their governmental thing before we smoothly transition away from Daniel, Sheila, and the others, and across the street, where we find this Leroy gentleman dealing with some snooty cops. This man turns out to be Matt's latest client. This plot point presents this idea that somewhat parallels Wilson's situation. Both men are simply unable to move forward and change, unable to escape their past and that extensive rap sheet. Pretty much the only component that doesn't really cross over into another, though it basically works on its own because it kind of acts as a bookend to this piece, is the odd and eerie muse material, which was brief though spooky. Not to mention, I was intrigued to learn that this masked creep is the inspiration behind some of the Born Again promo art. Very cool. This is a very pivotal piece, as by episode's end, Murdoch and Fisk are finally shown to begin to start fully embracing their Daredevil and Kingpin natures, respectively. Double D's catalyst turns out to be none other than Frank Castle, the Punisher, while Wilson's is, whether unwittingly or not, the powerful Vanessa. The scene between Matt and Frank is beautifully performed. I was admittedly momentarily worried that we were about to witness a derivative interaction in regard to the philosophical conversations had between the two back in season 2 of the original series. And although we do weave this classic conflict of ideals periodically into the scene, it works for me and feels appropriate. This is a reboot, which warrants at least a minor refresher. It's been years since these two have had an on-screen discussion, but more importantly, Matt is in a drastically different place now when compared to that rooftop talk, so it's inherently a different discussion. Frank delivers a sensational speech about loss leading to guilt, which then births vengeance, and you can see that Matt is frightened that Frank is speaking the truth. Nevertheless, Castle forces guilt and a coinciding rage to emerge. This motherfucker is understandably broken over his boy's fucked up murder. Frank kind of forces Matt to accept that the system is as broken as he, and while Bullseye is spending life behind bars, that is not an equal trade when comparing it to the loss of life of Franklin Nelson. I'm intrigued to learn just how far Matt is willing to go. After all, the theory Frank presents to Murdoch is that he believes he came to visit the Punisher to kind of ask for permission. I honestly find all of these vulnerable scenes focused on these commanding actors to be truly captivating, subtly so. Those very specific, minute moments of physical and verbal idiosyncrasy assist in cementing the statement that these two have really made these fictional creations their own, and I couldn't imagine anyone else in these roles. I love having an excuse to really dig into this bizarre romance, and I adore the cheeky nod from Heather nearing episode's end, as she alludes to the fact that she can't really divulge the deets, as it were, regarding the couple's she's currently counseling. Some fantastic dramatic irony there. I also must tip my toque to the badass moment in which Matt warns the scumbag corrupt officer to make sure to bring backup on the occasion that the two run into each other again. A couple more things. I'm remembering just how many fascinating elements are contained within this piece. Firstly, there's the genuinely funny material involving the Kingpin as he's trying to play by the rules, trying to understand the practical elements and steps having to be taken in his mayoral role, and being forced to endure a humorously bad musical performance. Then there's the incredible final scene in which we learn what has become of that Adam fella, Vanessa's former artistic flame. This episode's ending, besides being simply excellent, taught us a few things. There was a brief shot in an earlier episode in which we see the bloodied fists of Fisk before we cleverly cut to the bloodied fists of Murdoch. So we can now infer that the big bad Kingpin never really left. He's been handling things the old-fashioned way. Oh, and another lovely touch. Vanessa was gushing about Adam's hands in her session, which is our initial focus when we see the man within his little cell. Another great touch that displays Wilson embracing his true self is the fact that the big man is eating a very hearty meal, whereas up until this point, we've watched as he's eaten egg whites and asparagus, which lightened his step, as Matt pointed out. As you can most likely deduce, I've quite enjoyed the first quartet of episodes. There hasn't really been much I haven't been on board with up until this point, barring a couple janky CGI-centric shots from the premiere's opening sequence, but thankfully that hasn't returned to the screen. I dig the tone, the palpable and well-choreographed action, the smart, compelling dialogue. The one big question remaining, where do we go from here in terms of both story and character? Especially considering the fact that we're now well aware at this point that these writers are not afraid to kill a motherfucker off. And I'm cool with that, as long as it isn't gimmicky. And thus far, that hasn't at all been an issue. I was already a bit frightened regarding the fate of P.I. Cherry, as I mentioned earlier, but then I saw an online theory before seeing a relatively credible headline, which is so plausible that it enhanced this fear. Cherry, who was already considering retirement back in episode 1's opening, could perhaps be succeeded by private investigator and former colleague of Matt's, Jessica Jones. Besides the fact that Kristen Ritter has stated her interest in reprising this role, there have also been rumblings and rumors centered on certain characters, perhaps a defender, coming back into the fold. One of the central women in Matt's life could potentially be in trouble, Heather being the more likely candidate. And mind you, I'm thinking primarily about a pair of components throughout my blathering speculation here, which would be more emotionally impactful for Matt and us, the viewing audience, and which would present the most narrative possibilities and most intriguing narrative possibilities. Kirsten was essentially the replacement for Foggy as Matt's law partner and pal in general. On paper, in my opinion, it wouldn't be the most compelling option. In this case, my specific one lives, one dies scenario, it would be, again, on paper, some sort of Foggy death light. It would be the death of our hero's platonic partner, but with less emotional weight, as Murdoch and McDuffie have far less history, though perhaps it would deliberately act as a mirror to what happened to Nelson. I think there's a larger chance that Heather could be on the chopping block, as it were. These two are romantically involved, creating a particular vulnerability for Double M, while she, being a therapist, already, scarily, has ties to the powerful Mrs. Fisk and right-hand man British Wesley, not to mention that evidently troubled kid who spoke to Heather at her book signing, who's gotta be Muse, right? Also, in terms of subsequent stories, this would open up the role of Matt's love interest going forward, could open up the door to Jessica Jones, Kirsten herself, I'm just spitballing here, a returning Karen Page. Now, onto the Fisk front, staying on the subject of those that may have kicked the bucket by the time we've completed the 9-episode first season. I'm unsure of how exactly we've gravitated toward death, but here we are. I'm especially fascinated about what is going to happen to Vanessa, Daniel Blake, and BB Urich. Oh, and the badass commissioner. When it comes to both of these Fisk connects, I honestly foresee a bit of a Penguin situation. What I mean by that is, at the conclusion of the Penguin series, Oz essentially cuts off the weakness that is any sort of meaningful human connection. I believe Vanessa being murdered, or Fisk eventually killing young Daniel, like spoilers, Oz did with young protege Victor, would push him further toward a purely stone-cold, unwavering version of this villain. Now, in regard to BB Urich, someone asked me if I think she'll ever find out what Fisk did to her uncle. Fucking yeah. Why would you insert a character with a fucked up history by proxy with Wilson if it's never going to be paid off? Though I personally have an inkling that BB is already aware that Kingpin murdered her Uncle Ben, which is probably why she's so persistent with exposing the big bald bastard. I don't see him taking out 2 Urichs. If I were a betting man, I would think BB assists in, at least momentarily, bringing Fisk to justice, which surely would have made Ben proud. I use the word momentarily because we are talking about a multi-season run here, and I don't expect a massive absence from Wilson in a similar vein to what we got in season 2 of the Netflix series. And lastly, the Commissioner. This guy is as good as fucking dead after the lip he gave Fisk, though I respect the hell out of his bravery and solid moral compass. That being said, I hope he provides some sort of contribution to hurting Fisk in some way so that a bit of a legacy for the man is built.